Welcome back, warrior friends. Before we read our new book for today, I want to take a minute to go back through the books that we've already introduced and the genres that we've already talked about. The first book that we read was The Watsons Go to Birmingham, 1963, written by Christopher Paul Curtis. This book falls into the genre of historical fiction. The second book that we took a look at was Among the Hidden, written by Margaret Peterson Haddix, one of my all-time favorites. And this book falls into the sci-fi genre. Next up was a fantasy story called Tuck Everlasting, written by Natalie Babbitt. And finally, last week we read a sample from Tunnels, written by Roderick Gordon, which is an action-adventure story. And today we're going to be reading Charlie Joe Jackson's Guide to Not Reading, written by Tommy Greenwald. This book is going to fall into the genre of realistic fiction and humor. We're going to start with part number 1, which is titled How Not to Read. The plan: avoid reading at all costs. Chapter 1. My name is Charlie Joe Jackson, and I hate reading. And if you're reading this book, then you hate reading too. In fact, you do whatever you can to avoid reading. And the fact that you're holding this book in your hand right now is kind of shocking. I know exactly how you feel. I'm one of you. Just remember, you're not alone. We'll get through this together. Chapter 2. This book is a guide to people like us. It'll serve 2 purposes. 1, it will show people how to get out of reading. And 2, on those unfortunate occasions when you're not able to get out of reading and you're forced to read a book, it will be nice and easy to read a book. In all likelihood, you're reading this book against your will, and I sympathize with you. Therefore, I will also make you a solemn promise. The chapters will be short. The pages will be shorter. And whenever possible, I will keep to words that are the shortest, 1 syllable or less. I'm also going to include some specific tips about reading or not reading throughout this book. Some have to do with getting out of reading altogether, which is the strategy that I recommend. And some have to do with making the best of it. If you do have to read a book, it can be surprisingly hard to avoid reading a book at some point in your life. Even in middle school, as it turns out. You'll understand more as the story goes along. One of my book reading friends, Jake Katz, used to use the term when he was describing a paper he was writing. He became somewhat less of a friend right at that moment. Charlie Joe's tip number 1. If you have to read a book, make sure it has short chapters. This first tip is pretty self-explanatory. Think about it. If your mom or dad tells you to read 3 chapters before you go to bed, wouldn't you rather chapters be 1 page each instead of 10 pages each? Wouldn't you rather read 3 pages instead of 30 pages? That way, you're reading 27 less pages, but you can still say, hey, guess what? I read 3 chapters. Trust me, they'll never know the difference. Chapter 3. I've hated reading for as far back as I can remember. I didn't mind it when my mom would read to me when I was little. That was fine because I could stay up later, and sometimes she would fall asleep in my bed, which I have to admit I actually liked at the time. But then as I got older, she started to say, okay, now you read the rest of the chapter. And that was so not gonna happen. So I'd cry, and she'd read some more. By the way, I learned to cry on purpose that way. It's a useful skill. I've noticed that girls really like it when a guy gets teary sometimes, like at a movie, when the hero makes a supreme sacrifice for his one true love. For example, because that means he's sensitive or something, and the girls seem to like that. Personally, I prefer an action movie where somebody blows something up, or a comedy where some chubby guy falls in love with some gorgeous lifeguard who only speaks French. That's more my speed. Anyway, the whole crying in front of mom so I wouldn't have to read myself thing, that worked out pretty great until I was 10. Chapter 4. So here I am in middle school, and I'm proud to say I still hate to read, which is how this whole mess began. It started when I was supposed to read this book, Billy's Bargain, for my English class. It's about this kid, Billy, the bargain that he strikes with the devil to pitch a no-hitter in the championship game. But it turns out that the devil is actually just a guy that Billy's dad paid to pretend to be the devil, because Billy's dad figured that if Billy thinks he's made a deal with the devil to pitch a no-hitter, then Billy would have the confidence to actually go pitch a no-hitter. Well, it's not as complicated as I just made it sound. It's apparently a pretty good book, according to my teacher, Mrs. Farrell. But I guess it's not one of those, I guess it's got one of those, just believe in yourself and others will believe in you too, messages that grown-ups want kids to read over and over. Anyway, like I said, that's where I ran into trouble. I did what I usually do. I read the back cover and then the front inside flap, the first chapter and the last chapter. Then I sat next to my friend Timmy McGibney at lunch. For about 2 years, Timmy and I had what you might call an arrangement. I would buy him an ice cream sandwich and he would tell me all about what was in the rest of the book. It was a win-win situation, which is one of those weird expressions that parents use all the time. Naturally, I figured that we'd make the same deal as we always made. So, Timmy, I said, handing him an ice cream sandwich, Billy's Bargain was a pretty good book. How would you know? He asked. He always asked me that. It was kind of the routine that we had. Well, the beginning and the ending were good. I guess so, Timmy said. He was fiddling with his lacrosse stick. Lacrosse was the only thing that he loved more than ice cream sandwiches. Tryouts are coming up, huh? I said, pointing to a stick. Yup, he said. I waited for him to say something else, but he didn't. This was weird. Usually he could talk about lacrosse for hours. Timmy wolfed down his ice cream sandwich and he looked at mine. I'm actually really hungry today, he said. Really, really hungry. I suddenly got a pretty uneasy feeling. What do you mean, really, really hungry? Well, I'm saying I'm so hungry that I could eat 2 ice cream sandwiches, Timmy said. Maybe 3. I looked at him in disbelief. We'd had the same deal going for almost a year. I handed over a free ice cream sandwich for him. He had gotten enough ice cream sandwiches to start his own dairy farm. And now all of a sudden he was pulling this? I looked around and I checked my pockets for money. I considered my options and then I did the only thing I could do. I bought him another ice cream sandwich. After lunch, I went to the library and I looked up the word blackmail just to make sure I understood exactly what was happening. The librarian, Mrs. Reedy, she was an old friend of mine, even though she represents everything evil. Back in the old days, she was the librarian at my elementary school, and she used to try anything to get me to read. One time in first grade, she sat me down and she had me listen to this song called Grab a Book and Go. It was all about the joys of reading. One of the verses went, snuggle in your bed, the day is near its end, all alone. But you're not alone. A book can be a friend. I never quite forgave her. So, needless to say, she gave me quite a double take when I walked in. Charlie Joe, she said, did you make a wrong turn somewhere? I laughed. It's always a good idea to laugh at an adult's jokes, regardless of whether they're funny or not. I just need to look something up, I answered, trying to keep the conversation to a minimum so I could take care of business and get out of there. Mrs. Reedy looked at me and winked. Well, don't worry, Charlie Joe. Your secret is safe with me, she said. Chapter 5. I just looked at the previous chapter and realized it was way too long. I just ignored Charlie Joe's tip number 1. Sorry about that. It won't happen again. I hope that's enough to get you hooked into the humor and the realistic story that we have in Charlie Joe Jackson's Guide to Not Reading. It's a great book. I hope you guys check it out.